Well, Andrew Wallace is a shadow Attorney-General. Andrew Wallace, hello.
Hello, Ali. Good afternoon to you and your listeners.
Very busy day for you in Canberra. The Liberals are going to support the updated hate speech bill it's got through the House with Liberal support. It'll get through the Senate.
Yeah, well, it's not the hate speech bill, but I understand what you're saying, Ali.
That's a very shorthand term for what is a very complicated piece of legislation.
It is a very, very complex piece of legislation. It was too complex than it should have been, but there you go. So the House of Representatives passed both bills today. The coalition supported the amendments to the criminal code, but we did not support the changes to the gun laws. Those two bills will now go to the Senate tonight. They're in the Senate as we speak, and we expect that the Senate will sit late, and we're coming back tomorrow morning.
You said that the coalition supports the amendments to the criminal code, and I'll get to the amendments in a tick, but in fact a couple of national MPs voted against the bill, didn't they, in the House, and indeed a couple of national MPs abstained, including David Littleproud.
Yeah, there was one National Party member, Lou O'Brien, that voted against.
What about Colin Boyce? I thought he also...
No, look, I might be wrong on that, but I didn't see Colin in the chamber. But be that as it may, that's the beauty of the National Party and the Liberal Party. We don't disendorse someone if they have a different view and cross the floor, and long may that be the case. I spoke with Lou straight after the division, and he told me that in all good conscience he couldn't sign up to something that he didn't agree with, and I have no problem with that whatsoever.
Even though it's such a core piece and key piece of legislation, and they are your coalition partners?
Well, at the end of the day, the Liberal Party supported the bill because we believe that despite the shambolic nature of the way that the government conducted itself, Ali, I think it's really important to recognise that prior to Christmas, Susan Lee approached the Prime Minister and said, let's sit down and let's try and nut out a bipartisan approach to trying to strengthen our national security laws so that, Bondi never happens again. We do everything we possibly can to try and prevent it. No politician can obviously guarantee it. But the Prime Minister said, thanks but no thanks, I've got this, I'll do all of this myself. No consultation with the opposition whatsoever. And then, we all know it took 25 days to agree to a Royal Commission, came back and said only a matter of about 10 or so days ago that Parliament was going to be recalled, gave us a draft exposure of a bill and said take it or leave it. That's it. In fact, it was 8 days ago, if I remember correctly. Nearly 500 pages of legislation and in an explanatory memoranda that Dennis Shanahan described as an omnishambles of a bill.
I take your point, Andrew Wallace, and I know that that's a point that the Liberal Party has been making in recent days. But at the same time, how do you respond to those who feel a little confused, because you have been very vocal and your leader's been very vocal about wanting Gillian Segal's report, the Antisemitism Envoy's report and recommendations implemented in full. And if you look at that report, it did recommend strengthening, and I'm quoting, state and territory legislation addressing anti-Semitic and other hateful or intimidating conduct, including with respect to serious vilification offences and the public promotion of hatred. And yet it was those very provisions in the draft legislation that went to hatred that you refused to countenance and the government has acquiesced and removed them in order to get some of the legislation through. So can you understand people being confused? Because on the one hand, you want the Gillian Segal report, and on the other, you say no to provisions that would appear to be exactly what the report required or requested.
Well, Ali, the answer to that question is there's always the devil in the detail. And when the Prime Minister established and put out the exposure bill, he also provided or set up an inquiry in relation to the bill to be managed by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Now, I used to be the deputy chair of that committee for 3.5 years, so I know how it operates very well. He provided an incredibly tight, ridiculously tight window of opportunity for people to be able to provide submissions on complex legislation, very complex legislation. We're talking 48 hours for organisations to get their heads around this legislation and then provide submissions. Many well-known organisations like ASPI and the Law Council of Australia flatly refused and said, we can't do it. But be that as it may, more than 7,000 Australians provided submissions to say to the committee. Many of them said, don't sign up to this. Don't agree to these racial vilification laws because they go too far. So just because Gillian Segal says that we need to address anti-Semitism, we agree with that. But the devil is always in the detail. And where you had a situation with the racial vilification laws that effectively provided a defence for religious leaders if they were quoting the text of a religious book, that this defence effectively provided extremists to be able to. It was a handbook on how not to break the law. Is
it the main Liberal Party concern with the provisions as they were originally?
That they went too far. And they didn't. That in more than around 500 pages of legislation and explanatory memoranda, the legislation did not quote Islamic extremist or extremism once, not once. Now, most people would acknowledge that the killing of 1,500 people at Bondi on the 14th of December last year was as a result of Islamic extremism and hateful anti-Semitism.
But I'm just curious as to why we're talking about legislation that will sit on the books, for years and decades to come. Why is it important that is in the legislation? Surely the more important thing is outlining in detail what would qualify as a crime under the legislation.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Ali.
Well, why is it so important to put Islamic extremism in there?
Oh, sorry. Because Susan Lee set a test to the Prime Minister before Christmas. She said, we need legislation that will deal with two things, anti-Semitism and Islamic extremism, because ultimately it's those two things that we need to address. Bearing in mind, we came back to Parliament at a special sitting of Parliament in the middle of January. I can't remember the last time that happened, to have a condolence motions that we did yesterday, but then to address purely and simply, the only thing on the agenda was to address the legislation to try and do the best we can to avoid another Bondi. So it's really important. If you can't name the problem, how do we fix it?
Andrew Wallace, the Prime Minister has made it very clear that it was now or never for those hate speech provisions that have been removed from the bill.
The racial vilifications
provisions.
Yep.
I do note that that Allegra Spender, whose electorate includes Bondi, she says that the bill as it is will not keep the Jewish community safe. She says much more work needs to be done. Would the Liberal Party be prepared to work with the government should the government decide to pursue further change in the future?
Well, the Prime Minister has indicated that he's not going to reintroduce the racial vilification provisions in this term. So it's a hypothetical question.
Would you in government?
Hypothetical question. I mean, ultimately, it would depend upon the circumstances of the day.
Would you acknowledge that it's a virtually impossible thing to get through? I mean, we've had this conversation many times.
These things are incredibly difficult, Ali, because wherever you run up against issues about freedom of speech, they always create problems. Look, I'm sure you don't want to live in a security state. I don't think any of your listeners would want to live in a security state. And whenever you talk about national security legislation, there's always a fine balance between getting protecting Australians, but then not, but on the other hand, ensuring that we aren't impacting upon their freedoms and liberties that we have fought so hard to achieve in this country.
Andrew Wallace, I do just want to say I'm getting a couple of texts, and I obviously missed it as well, but I think you said 1,500 people were killed at Bondi. I'm sure that's not what you meant.
If I said 1,500, that is not what I meant.
No, 15. You meant 15, yes. Just a final question. The gun buyback scheme, the gun control laws, the Liberals voted against them.
Yeah.
What's your key issue?
Well, the key issue is that the Prime Minister indicated very early on after Bondi that he wanted to. He was effectively playing politics. He was trying to blame Bondi on the ability for Australians to be able to get guns, and he wanted, and in fact spoke about a John Howard buyback scheme, referring back to Port Arthur in 1996. Now, that is not what this bill will deliver when it comes into pass, because the 1996 John Howard buyback scheme provided fair market value for people when they handed in their weapons, and it also provided fair market value for additional pieces like scopes, spare parts, and other pieces that are involved in a particular rifle that might be caught by these provisions. Now, the John Howard buyback scheme also provided compensation to businesses that would be affected by these new laws.
So what was your concern, that there wasn't sufficient compensation?
There was no aspect whatsoever about fair market value being provided to people when they hand in their weapons. It's basically done by, well, if you have this type of a weapon, then you'll get this much money, done on a schedule type arrangement. It's not fair market value. And there's also no compensation for any of these additional pieces of equipment, and no compensation whatsoever to businesses that will suffer as a result.
Do you think the legislation that is going to pass today would help prevent another Bondi? And I know, yesterday we heard from the father of Matilda, the youngest victim of Bondi, who made the point that the legislation tends to impact the law-abiding, that those who don't abide the law don't care about the law.
Look, I mean, you could say the same thing about every law, Ali, whether it's seatbelts or speeding, or in these cases much more serious crimes. I don't think that should prevent us from stopping to do everything we possibly can as a parliament to try and prevent the sort of hate speech that leads to violence. And that's one of the reasons why we were prepared to ultimately agree to the prohibited hate groups provisions in these bills, because organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir, the National Socialist Network, that thus far have failed to meet the terrorist listing lexicon, that line in the sand, that the intelligence agencies and departments have told successive governments that they have not satisfied that legislative criteria. Well, if we hadn't have agreed to that piece of legislation in relation to the prohibited hate groups, then the neo-Nazis would still be in business, the Hizb ut-Tahrir would be unable to be listed, and the prohibited hate groups effectively, the piece of legislation will provide similar terrorist organisation restrictions. It'll be an offence if you belong to the groups. It'll be an offence if you provide support or financial funding to them. We need to make it as difficult as possible for these organisations to spread their hate, and that's what these provisions will do.
Andrew Wallace, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ali.
Andrew Wallace there, Shadow Attorney-General.
Authorised by Andrew Wallace, LNP, Boccarina, Queensland.